Hey everybody, my name's Axel Villamil. We're here back on 24 Shades of Blue. We're here with Peter Code, who's the acting staff superintendent in charge of detective operations, and Steve Irwin, recently retired inspector. Gentlemen, how are you doing today?
Really well, and really pleased to be here.
Excellent, Axel. Thank you for having us here.
Super excited to have you two here. For everybody that does not know them, they are, if anything, heavily amazing people, highly trained and highly, I guess, respected in their industry. So it's an honor to be here and speak with you two. We're going to get right into it. This is a very heavy topic, but also a very important one to reflect upon, to talk about. Today's topic for the episode is 9/11. And one of the first questions, our team had for you is, what were the Toronto Police's actions and reactions when 9/11 took place? And, I'm sure you both had different experiences. So I guess we can start with Peter and then go to you, Steve.
My experience is going to be very different than Steve. Steve was actually working in the industry, we'll call it, in relation to national security at the time. But for me, I was working as a detective at the sexual assault squad. And I remember I had an active case that morning, and actually from the night before. And I was in an apartment of a building in downtown Toronto where a sexual assault had occurred. The person that was sexually assaulted was over at the hospital at that time with healthcare professionals and also officers. But I was at the apartment assessing the scene, and we were just about to do a forensics examination of it. And I remember the television being on. And while we were at that point looking at a horrific scene, we all became glued to the television and saw the first plane that goes into the World Trade Center. And at that time, it was very much an unknown what had happened. It wasn't until the second plane hit that it was like a shoe dropping, where you knew exactly what was going on. At that point, I think there was a lot of chatter from the commentators that it could have been a medical episode from the pilot and so on. But I just remember it being incredibly unnerving. And then as that day progressed, obviously this feeling of anxiety and anxiousness of, okay, so not only what has happened in New York City and the huge loss that was happening there, and you automatically think of your law enforcement partners and your emergency responder partners, and if this happens anywhere in the world. But then it was also the what will happen next, and now what do we have to do in our city to make sure that we keep it safe? So my experience very, very different. But it's funny, I didn't know you were going to ask me that question. I thought it was going to go to Steve, and that's the first time I've actually spoken about that. But it's incredibly vivid for me.
Oh, that's I feel like it's vivid for a lot of us. It's very interesting. Actually, you went right to the point of, clearly you've been in the industry for so long where you go, okay, what do we do now? Rather than, wow, I'm in shock or whatever that is for, I guess, a civilian. Since you two are both in the industry, I feel like that's a common reaction is let's go. I'm not running away from the fire. I'm going to run towards it and figure it out for not just another city, but my own city as well. So that's very amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Steve.
And certainly you nailed it into that we do run towards the issues, not away from them. So on September 11th, I'll go back a little bit before that. So I had a boss in intelligence in 1995 who had the foresight to see that terrorism was an issue. And we created a subsection within our security section of intelligence that it was the anti-terrorism section. So I started that unit in 1995 and had one partner. As we went forward, we dealt with not only terrorist concerns and looking at those from a city perspective and our public safety of our city, but also threat investigations that involved people of profile, public profile, and so on. But bounce forward to 9/11, I was actually at intelligence, still in that unit. And I was actually in Belleville, Ontario, at an annual conference held by the Criminal Intelligence Service of Ontario. So all sorts of police partners and intelligence partners, not just police, including American counterparts. At the time, the conference on 9/11 had started, it was in fact a law enforcement officer from the US that had made the opening remarks. So, we started about 10 to 9. He'd spoke, and about 9:10, 9:15-ish, we broke for a minute. Actually, everyone else was dressed more casually. I decided to go up a set of stairs to my room, take off my jacket and tie. The cleaning lady happened to be in my room with the TV on. And it was the second plane that I saw. And she said, "That's the second one." So my wheels are turning. I went back downstairs. So there were a couple hundred people at this conference from intelligence, so law enforcement, police intelligence, but also other intelligence agencies and representatives. Our pagers. So I said to my colleague that I was there with, who was a detective sergeant, I said, "Robbie, this is going on. It's a terrorist attack. We need to turn our minds to." And it was interesting because the whole room started to light up very quickly with our pagers. We didn't have the cell phones and smartphones that we have now, but certainly it was the pagers and then picking up phones. So we very quickly, the conference ended immediately and everyone started to scramble back to their home agencies. We reached out to our unit commander of the day, Tony War, a retired deputy chief, and he said, "Why don't we set up our joint intelligence group?" So we had a joint intelligence group with partner agencies, which could include Canadian Forces, D&D, Department of National Defense, CSIS, RCMP, OPP, the surrounding police services. We've done that historically for major events. And so if you had a royal visit, or you would set up a short-term JIG, a joint intelligence group for that. He said, "Why don't we set up the JIG?" Robbie and I got in the vehicle, packed our stuff in the vehicle, and I was on the phone driving at a pretty high rate of speed, heading back to Toronto because we're setting up our JIG in Toronto. But on the phone, reaching out to all my partners, had their phone numbers, knew them, and said, "We're setting up a JIG. It'll be in our building at Toronto Intelligence." And so there were two components that we looked at immediately. One was supporting our American friends and helping, but also getting information and access so we could assess the threat and the concern that we would have to deal with in our own right. And if it's happened there, will there be a domino effect? Will it be happening elsewhere? And so we're immediately starting to monitor not only North America, but certainly all, I'll say, the Western countries, our allied countries, to see if there's something more happening and if it's broader than it is. So our response was, it started on September 11th, that afternoon. We had 12 partner agencies, including the FBI, and the rest were Canadian agencies. And then we ran it 24/7 for the first few weeks. And then as it got manageable, we went back to about 6 a.m. till midnight every day. And then we went through until February 2002. We had that joint intelligence group stood up.
So no sleep.
To take in all that information. Not a lot. Go to work and it was dark, and wake up or go home when it was dark. There was no daylight.
I think I was only 9 when that happened, but I remember for about, I think half a year, that's all we saw. That's all I knew on the news. And just like trying to comprehend what had actually had happened was very, it was almost educational from what the schooling system had to do for us. They had to explain what was going on. So because it was so much part of our lives, and if anything, so heavily part of your lives. And now my question was, how was both your mental health during this time? Especially for you, Steve, like it's a very taxing time. You were probably exhausted, but I'm sure, was it more towards that, I just want to figure out what we need to do next?
I believe, and certainly, Peter and I both have spent a lot of time in specialized areas of policing. I think we build up a bit of a resilience. Some of it is the way we were brought up in our nature, and some of us perhaps do better at it than others. I think it's a culmination of how you're brought up, your life experiences, your policing experiences, help you to maybe be, or certainly I speak for the two of us, I believe our resilience is pretty good. And we actually do sort of click into that. We have a job to do. And so it takes a day or two to juggle your personal life and arrangements on that to then say, we're going to be working really long hours going forward. But like Peter, I had worked in sexual assault. I had worked in homicide before where we worked long hours. We weren't clock watchers. So it became that. But we were also in the same boat as you in trying to comprehend what this was. I will say, and I've said this often in the 20 years, 9/11 taught us in policing, and certainly in North America, there are no rules. Where prior to 9/11, you think, no one would do that. They did it. And what they did was so significant that now you are not so quick to dismiss, that could never happen. It's like, no, now we get into a more in-depth and broader assessment of threats to determine what we can and can't do. And we look broadly around the world to see what is happening for to learn in an ability to try and respond immediately to that situation, but if we have our own as well and what we're going to do.
It's definitely a flip of the switch that you have to do. And I think that takes a lot of courage, but also confidence and experience to do that. How about for you, Peter?
I think we really weren't that good at taking care of our mental wellness back in 2001. I think that we've changed quite a bit. We've come a long way. I'm very proud of what police agencies are doing now for their members. And when I say police agencies, all frontline emergency responders. But there was, I'd suggest, pretty few things in place back in 2001, and it was a different culture then. Part of the big push for Toronto Police Services is certainly to change our culture and to be able to embrace scenarios where you don't feel comfortable and where you do feel vulnerable, and we're doing that now, which I think is going to. Well, I can already see that it's changed our membership, and certainly changed for the better.
Absolutely. I think speaking about big issues like this is always tough. Experience it. But for you, Peter, could you tell us what your experience was like? Also, speaking with first responders who were first to arrive at the scene when 9/11 took place.
So yes, I can. So my experience is quite a bit different than Steve's. So when I actually spoke with NYPD officers for the first time, really about what happened on that day, it was about a decade and change later. It was quite a ways afterwards, and the reason for it was Chief Raymer had asked that I take a good, healthy look at the plans that we had in place for the Toronto Police in lieu of a number of attacks that had happened overseas in Europe. And one of the ways that I tackled that was to go to New York City and actually speak with the NYPD, who I believe were really leading the world in relation to the four corners of planning, of mitigation, of planning, of response and recovery. And so I went and spoke with the officers there about what plans they had in place, and and how we could then translate that into how it fit here in Toronto. We are very different cities. We are very different nations, but certainly we could learn a great deal from the NYPD. And what I wasn't surprised by it, but what I found was, even though it was a decade later, there were the officers that I spoke to, it felt like it was a very recent event.
Mm-hmm.
It was still incredibly vivid and impactful for them. And there was at times a letting go of emotions when they were recollecting items, and then would use that as a caveat to say, and this is why we now do this. I found it interesting because as law enforcement officers worldwide, we take an oath of community service to keep our communities safe. And I can tell you that the sense of unity that police officers, law enforcement professionals around the world have together because of that oath is immense. And for the most part, we have a lot of control and a lot of influence in keeping our communities safe. We can deploy officers, we can write plans, we can analyze crime data, and we can respond appropriately. But what I found from that event and speaking with the officers was there was a sense of loss of control. There was a sense of disbelief. There was no warning before this happened. And the sheer magnitude of that event was not comparable to anything that had ever happened in the USA. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it's such a different thing for us to even try to comprehend that. Um, and it's interesting because I can relate that a little bit to an event that happened in Toronto, if I
Yeah,
can.
absolutely.
That happened back in April of 2018, and it's now been referred to many times as a van attack in Toronto. And at the time, I was at Intelligence Services, and my good friend Steve was actually our conduit at the RCMP. And when that first happened, and we were talking about comprehension, when that first happened, it came in as likely a medical episode where a driver had failed medically somehow and had now driven off the roadway and onto the sidewalk and had struck pedestrians. And there was a very switched on sergeant from our emergency management unit that called me. And he said, "I don't know what this is. I think this could be just a medical complaint. It could be just a car accident, but it doesn't seem right. We're just getting the first initial calls. I'm going to give you a heads up on that." And I think pre 9/11, we probably wouldn't have thought too much about that. But when I got that phone call, immediately I picked up the phone and called Steve.
Yeah.
And said, "Steve, not sure what this is. I have a mandate to call the RCMP and the OPP whenever we have an event that we believe could be a terrorist act." I did not believe that at this point. I had no idea what we had. But I knew that I'm going to call Steve and just say, "Hey, heads up, be close to your phone, and I'll give you more information as we get it." I spoke with the investigator that ran that case. And it's obviously, I don't want it all to compare in magnitude what happened on September 11th. They're not the same. But for the people that were impacted and victimized and injured, and the families and the people that witnessed it, still incredibly impactful to them. But I remember speaking very recently to the officer that investigated it. And he said there was a couple of police officers that were in line of a takeout for a coffee and witnessed one of the first strikes and believed it was just a failed to remain accident where the person has not remained at the scene, had driven away. And they ran to the person that had been injured and started rendering first aid, and then looked up to see that the van was still driving and still acting quite violently. And that feeling already of, oh my God, this isn't just an accident. And then the question, the doubt of, should I have chased the van? Should I have stayed here with this person? They did the right thing. But it's just that kind of an impact on a police officer. I saw that when I spoke with the officers from NYPD, even though it had been a decade later. And I saw it when I spoke with the officers after that attack in April and then other events that happened that same year.
It's an incredible experience that you're not going to forget, because not only it was, I'm sure, very traumatic, but also at the same time, they had to be at their probably best at that point to make those calls. So for you, Steve, when you were speaking to them, Peter, you're talking about 10 years later, you were there probably talking to them on the day, or some of them, or your NYPD counterparts down there. What was the feeling that you got from them at that time?
The officers that I dealt with, and the ones that stand out most in my mind, are when we started the liaison program with NYPD, which Toronto was the inaugural and first relationship for their program. And that was on a handshake between then Commissioner Ray Kelly of NYPD and Toronto Police Chief Julian Fantino. When the first liaison officer arrived in Toronto, he worked in my section of intelligence. And certainly what he described, and on the anniversary every year, so Paul was here for a few years, we're still in the program. We're on our fourth NYPD officer that's embedded in Toronto Police. Every 9/11, we always go back to what their experiences were. That first officer really, we became good friends, and I was the manager of the section. And so also had to look out, and it was new. This is a foreign officer, unarmed, embedded in the Toronto Police and in Canada. There was a lot of learning that we had to do on protocols and exchange of information. But certainly, I always remember Paul speaking of how clear the sky was, what a perfect day September 11th, 2001 was, and when this happened. And then the response, and every officer I've spoken to, which is numerous, FBI agents that would have been in New York, and not only in New York, but the other areas, Washington, where the other attacks and planes went down. Every one of them goes back, you can see, to that moment, as we all do, to those major traumatic events in our lives. It takes us back to probably the odors come back to our minds, images, but certainly the impact it had. But it's interesting because, again, as police officers, we have this, I guess, learned resilience. And we go from being in a moment a spectator and processing like everyone else to what do we need to do and where does that go? It's interesting with the program throughout the 4 liaison officers that we've had, it's always a constant evolution. And to Peter's point, that relationship and that ability to go to New York and learn from them is an example that we've gone back to that trough so many times in so many different ways in looking at how we're dealing with our ability to respond to terrorism or a terrorist attack.
Absolutely. Was there ever any tension when NYPD came down and started working with you, or was it just like, let's just learn about what's going on right now? Was there any like departmental tension?
So between NYPD and Toronto, so NYPD, largest police force in the U.S., Toronto, largest in municipal police force in Canada, there was none between us. Both NYPD experienced problems with the FBI because they are the federal law enforcement agency that are, I'll say through some legislation, are technically the ones who are the go-between with international partners. And the RCMP here have the primary responsibility for national security and national security investigations. And I use the term primary responsibility, not sole. So there is challenges more about and about the type of information that gets shared and being adherent to guidelines so that we didn't give up information that we shouldn't on Canadians in particular, which the RCMP normally were the conduit to share information outside, I'll say, of normal criminal investigations, which is law enforcement to law enforcement. But because both the FBI and the RCMP have primary responsibility for terrorism, national security, a little bit of challenge with municipal to municipal and the embedded part. But it's benefited, I'll say all law enforcement partners and intelligence agencies in Canada, that relationship, as NYPD, I think, has benefited their federal partners as well.
Absolutely. And I think just for the rest of the audience that's listening, would love to explain exactly what the liaison program does, just from top to bottom. And then we can kind of get into also how they're working with us today currently and with all the other countries as well. I would love to see if, Peter, you can give us that.
To me, it's a fantastic program. Steve was part of intelligence services when it actually started. I've had the great opportunity to be down in New York and actually visit the liaison office. There's one of our officers that is down there currently, but we've had one of our officers down there since the very beginning of this program. And what you have, and I'll be a little cautious in everything that I say here, but basically what you have is one large room, open concept room, where you have law enforcement officers from agencies from around the world. And the ability that when something does happen, for those liaison officers to get exactly what it is that has happened to them with accurate information, and then be able to fan that information out with the intent of making sure that there is not a reciprocal event, a copycat event, or if it's a part of a greater plan where it would happen again or happen in tandem with whatever else has happened throughout the world. We've spoken about some events that have happened in Toronto. So just as much as we have a liaison officer in New York City, part of my role was to make sure that liaison officer knew exactly what I knew about the events that were happening, so that information then could be fanned out And so many of our law enforcement partners from around the world would have known in real time what was happening here in our city of Toronto to make sure that, okay, is this part of a bigger plan? What do we need to do? And so on.
Interesting. So like things with Paris, for example, things that happened in Paris, we were noticed. We were notified here, right, with our officers, vice versa, et
Yes.
cetera. Okay, amazing. So it just sounds like, and I've said it to you too before, it sounds like just the Avengers of police are all meeting together.
So that's not how we would put it, but I certainly appreciate your comments.
No problem.
It's interesting is that even if there's not an event that happens on Canadian soil or in Toronto as a result of something that happens somewhere else in the world, there is certainly going to be a community that is impacted by it. There is certainly going to be a community that feels vulnerable, may feel that they could be a target of something because of something that's happened elsewhere in the world. And so when we learn of an event that's happened elsewhere that perhaps did target a community, then we can deploy officers to an area to be able to show we're here. We're here. We understand what's happened elsewhere in the world. We have no information that there's a threat currently here in Toronto soil, but we are here. And by our presence takes some comfort. And if we can at all ease that anxiety, that's part of what we actually have to do.
I had a question. Do you ever think that Toronto should do it the other way around, where I know it's NYPD is situating their officers in different countries and training places? Do you think it would be beneficial? I mean, if Toronto were to do its own liaison program, or is it just because NYPD is running it, it just makes sense that way? Because there's already a foundation.
It's that the foundation is there. What's really important for you to know is that our relationships with other law enforcement professionals does not stop with the NYPD liaison program. We have fantastic relationships with other countries, other cities that are actually not part of that liaison program. It's something that we do as professionals. So I believe that the benefits of creating another one, they may not be as vast as one would initially think. So I believe the NYPD program is an excellent program. It's the foundation. It works well. And then aside from that, we can always spread out and actually get more connections and partnerships with other agencies.
I'll also offer, so what we've seen in relation to terrorism is at the highest level, at the chief and executive level of police services in the Five Eyes. So the Five Eyes are Canada, United States, the UK, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Australia. They have a leadership in counterterrorism course that it's the chief and the deputies and at Peter's level that will go on that. So they also form at the executive level relationships. Terrorism, and certainly in the Western countries, is a significant concern to every police leader. So when you have the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the major cities chiefs, which are for North America, though there's always a terrorism education component and networking that goes on. So it's not just, I'll say, at the working and sort of middle to senior management, it's at the executive level. Those relationships are hugely beneficial when we need to get situational awareness, and that's really what the liaison program provides. A very quick example is, so on the train attacks in London, England, there was actually a liaison officer from the UK embedded with the RCMP who happened to be in Toronto, and I was, so on the day before, on the 6th of July, I woke him up at the Prince Hotel to say, "Hey, Neil, congratulations, you won the Olympic bid." On the 7th, I woke him up to say there's a tragic event. My interest with him was to find out what was the method of attack. So was it suicide bombers, or did they leave packages on the trains? So, a briefcase. Or was it, and also what type of explosive? Because my wheels are turning that if it happened in the UK, they're 5 hours ahead of me. It can happen here. We're named by bin Laden as a target. So what happens there could happen here. My wheels are already turning for what's the response to our transit system, because we could end up with bombs on our subways.
I think I fully remember when this happened.
So Chief Blair was just appointed. There were two acting deputies, and he put about 200 officers into the transit system for people to have confidence. But he's looking for us in the intelligence side to determine what we can and is there more. So should we look at having bomb dogs deployed and accessible? Are they suicide bombers, or are they suspicious or abandoned packages or briefcase? So if it's a briefcase, then we need to put out to our frontline officers, if you get a call for someone's left a briefcase, do not approach it. Treat it like a bomb threat on this day until we get more information and can better assess. So it ratchets up our mitigation strategies. And I won't say we pull out our playbook, because I don't need to pull it out. It's pretty in there.
Right, yeah.
As it is with Peter, and then it's like, so what do we do? And messaging that is equally important through our corporate communications, so that the public has confidence that we're on our game, and what are the impacts. Those attacks that happen anywhere in the world, and likewise for us, when they happen here, sharing that information is important, because everyone in our world of anti-terrorism is already thinking, am I at risk? And is it a cell? Is it part of a bigger terrorist group? And we're going to see a domino effect that will hit. The first domino is knocked over and the next ones are coming. And that will happen every single time there's a major event. So providing and into that network of LOs, situational awareness out and in is hugely important. And that we don't waste time and resources. And look over here, when we're spending time here because it's a normal ongoing investigation that requires our attention, but we're distracted by something that has a huge high profile and may need a response.
Of course. I feel like there's a huge theme I get with this podcast in general, is that the more information, the better. And regardless if you don't think that information is valid, having it at least, there to sort it out to not be valid is better than nothing at all. And it's very interesting because from my perspective as a civilian, when those things were happening, we don't necessarily think, at least I didn't, was like, oh, it could happen, but it's a lower chance because I'm all the way over here on the other side of the world. But you both and the rest of the department and your team go, absolutely not, because of your experiences and you being in the field, see that this is a high chance and possibility that it could happen here. So on those times when there were package bombs in other countries or what have you, I did notice, and it's just coming together now, and I'm just kind of realizing it, like, wow, Toronto police really, put their chests up at the same exact areas, or because they didn't want to see a copycat or other things happening. Because a lot of my friends were going, why is there so many police officers in the subway today? And for that very reason, is to make sure that that doesn't happen here. So in terms of that process, I know we can get into the details of the planning, but how do you even start to fathom what to do once you hear something happen across the world, and how to protect us in counterterrorism? So
the response that you speak of, and I'm glad to hear that you did notice that.
Absolutely.
And you're thinking about that now, it's quite immediate. So that's part of what we have planned for. That's part of, it's a mitigation strategy, and it's two-pronged. One, it could deter somebody from doing something, but the second part, and just as importantly, is to create that level of calm, or at least security for the members of our city. And so every impact that happens around the world, it certainly will hit home with someone here. And so to us to be able to respond to that, that's one of the easier things, I think, for us to do. And it's something that we have been doing for a great many years.
Another part that we do is we look when there are events. So a great example, when we had the blackout in 2004, we have an emergency response, and we have a public safety emergency management unit that puts out, frontline policing and so on for what is our normal business. I am reaching in to the hydro people to say, what's the cause of that? That's one piece. So I was not embedded into the integrated national security enforcement team with the RCMP at that time, but I was the manager that was the conduit to them daily. I'm equally conscious and expect to know from them where any investigations they have are, and do they have their people in pocket? Because not that they caused the blackout, But with the blackout, there's vulnerability. And so part of what we do and our thinking is, what are the vulnerabilities and how do we manage those to a point that we're satisfied? And that I'll say, if there's people being investigated who may have terrorist affiliations and want to do something bad, that they can't become opportunistic when that blackout. Or an ice storm or another weather situation. So we're constantly looking, and to your point, it's getting that information and our analysts knowing, and it's not always geographical. It's often, sometimes we've had threats to the financial sector. So is it the financial sector or is it the financial district? If you're going to blow up the financial district, it's not just the financial district. There's lots else. It's downtown Toronto. But is it a financial sector threat from a terrorist group, which might be, an internet or a virtual attack as opposed to a bomb and other things they can do to certainly harm the economy and cause us other grief?
Absolutely. Pre 9/11, I wouldn't know that a blackout is considered a possible, terrorist attack. Even before, I was on stage exactly when the blackout happened and Stratford Festival shut down. Boom. So, it was scary for us, what was going on. But at the same time, I was a kid at the time, it's a blackout, whatever. But you think now, even with internet and technology, that could be something wiping out the grid from other events that have happened, very recently, taking it out like that. So everything, like you said in the beginning, there's no surprises anymore. There's no rules anymore, or at least
we turn our minds to it.
Exactly.
We constantly are turning our minds to it.
What is the other thing? Yeah. What it could be, because I think sometimes we may be living in the idea that it's just one thing or the other, when in reality it could be so many other things. So that's why, you do what you do. I guess one of my last points was, how has the world changed in the past 20 years since the terrorist attack, 9/11? Now, this is a big loaded question. There's a lot that has changed. Maybe get it to the point of where maybe you see how the force has changed, as well as how counterterrorism is also handled.
There was probably a razor sharp focus on certainly bin Laden and his group, Al Qaeda, and perhaps a little bit broader for threats from that sect. It's interesting because over the years, we've had other terrorist groups here and doing fundraising, maybe not looking to attack in Canada, but certainly fundraising. Canada is a bit of a golden egg for a number of different groups that are not here. They're based elsewhere in the world. But certainly, so I think what we've learned is get out of tunnel vision. I think we've recognized that the threats are broader, and certainly more recently, and we see it in the media, our own domestic threat, and we see it in the U.S. in particular, but it's crossed into Canada for sure. The right wing, the white supremacists, and that they're not the only ones. It's actually become far more complex and complicated as to what their either ideological, religious, or political motives are, which are part of the terrorist definition. But it's interesting because there's lots of crossover. So it's not homogenous to, it's either ideological, political, or religious. You could have a religious political overlap and then an ideological one. And we could think of, some of the groups, the extremist groups. And if you look, you really couldn't pin them down and say they fit perfectly into this and only this. They don't. They overlap. And certainly, Peter, in the chair that you are, and certainly in what you've seen, the evolution in your time too, from someone that was not embedded with it, would be interesting to go from what that was to obviously what you know now.
So I agree with everything that you've just said. The evolution of, when you think about the attacks that happened back on September 11th, the day before that, that was unfathomable. And so now, and I think Steve mentioned it earlier on, is now everything's a possibility from a law enforcement perspective, but that's not meant to tell everyone that we need to live our lives in this state of fear or anxiety, like something is going to happen. What I find is since September 11th, the biggest challenge I think that we have is collectively to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of thinking that we can identify a terrorist by something other than evidence. Your religious affiliation does not make you a terrorist. How you dress, how you speak, the way that you were brought up, your cultural norms, none of those things make you a terrorist. And we have to be very careful not to think that we can identify them on anything on that spectrum. It's evidence-based. The strength of the city of Toronto is its diversity, but its greatest power is the ability to live in harmony. And I think if we are not aware or not at least keen to the possibility of an unconscious bias, that we could really fall into a path that would be more destructive for our communities than actually growth and prosperity. And so to me, that is our biggest challenge of let's continue to realize this is a small group of individuals. It is not commonplace, and it is certainly not defined by all of those things that I've just stated. That's our biggest challenge.
I love that. I think even though it is a challenge, it's also nice to know that it is a goal, right? You know, that it's like we're here for the evidence, we're here to get the information, and that's all that matters at that point. And finally is the safety of the community. And that's the main thing
Absolutely.
that we love to hear. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. Peter, Steve.
Thank you.
My name is Axel Villamils, 24 Shades of Blue, and we're out.